Good evening and welcome to Seven Stories Up. You Can't Kill a Man Because of the Books He Reads. Angelo Herndon's Fight for Free Speech by Brad Snyder, who will be in conversation with Brian Jones. We are delighted to have you all joining us tonight at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Allison Ellis, and I'm a supervising librarian of programming and outreach here at SNFL. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this evening's conversation possible. And I'd like to encourage you to visit MIPL's website and take a look at upcoming programs just like this one. This season, we have an excellent lineup featuring new nonfiction, music, and more, and we would love for you to join us in this space again. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Brian Jones is the director of the Center for Educators and Scholars at the New York Public Library. He is a former scholar in residence and former associate director of education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. Yes. We have special edition library cards downstairs for a little plug. His first book, The Tuskegee Student Uprising, a history, won the Black Caucus of the American Library Association's 2023 Nonfiction Literary Award. The St. Thomas More Professor in Law and History at Georgetown Law, Brad Snyder teaches constitutional law, sports law, and the American legal history. His book, You Can't Kill a Man, tells the story of a Black Communist Party organizer charged with attempting to incite insurrection and the people who rallied to his cause during his 5-year quest for freedom. Snyder's previous book, Democratic Justice, Felix Frankfurter, The Supreme Court and the Making of the Liberal Establishment, was the first comprehensive biography of the Harvard Law School professor, New Deal power broker, and Supreme Court justice. A Guggenheim Fellow, Snyder has published law review articles about constitutional history and is the author of The House of Truth, A Washington Political Salon, and the Foundations of American Liberalism. Prior to teaching law, he worked as an associate at Williams & Connolly LLP and wrote 2 critically acclaimed books about baseball, including A Well-Paid Slave, Curt Flood's Fight for Free Agency in Professional Sports. A graduate of Duke University and Yale Law School, he clerked for the Honorable Dorothy W. Nelson of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. For more information about Professor Snyder's work, please go to his website, bradsnyderauthor.com. And it is now my pleasure to bring up tonight's speakers.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. As somebody who works at the library, I actually come to this program series a lot, and I sit usually right over there. And this is my first time participating in one, and I'm so excited to talk with you about this book, You Can't Kill a Man Because of the Books He Reads. I thought I knew about Angelo Herndon, and actually I'm curious to know if people in the audience think you know about Angelo Herndon. Just by show of hands, who here has heard of, before this book, The Case of Angelo Herndon? Okay, great. So be curious to hear when we get to Q&A about some of your questions or some of what brings you to this event tonight. I just want to say right off the bat that this is a remarkable book. It is an incredible story, really well told. We're going to get into it. It's a heroic story. It's tragic, I think. We were just debating backstage whether it's tragic. Kind of fascinating and unlikely cast of characters, a legal saga, and then eventually I want to get to implications for today. But first, I want to ask you just who is Angelo Herndon? He's kind of a man of mystery.
Yeah. First, Brian, thank you so much for taking time out of the end of your busy day, and thanks to the audience for coming today, and Allison for reaching out to me months ago to come here and talk. It's a real honor to be here. I'm at just an amazing institution where I did a lot of research for this book, and we can talk about some of this. So thank you again, Brian. I'm really just pleased to be here. Herndon was written about in the newspapers, and I'm going to use air quotes. They called him the Cincinnati Negro, right? That's newspapers all over America when he was arrested, used that phrase. And it's true that his father was a coal miner in Cincinnati and actually died of tuberculosis outside of Cincinnati. But Angelo Herndon wasn't from Cincinnati. Angelo Herndon was from the Black Belt of Alabama. He was the son of tenant farmers and sharecroppers and lived in a life of extreme rural poverty. And I think, his big move was leaving home at a very young age with his brother Leo to go to Birmingham and to go into the mines, basically the coal mines in Birmingham, to try to make money for his family. And that process of leaving home and going into the mines and seeing what the life of a black coal miner was, because the life of a black coal miner is very different than the life of a white coal miner, because in those days only the white coal miners were unionized, and the black coal miners were, as they said at the time, the last hired and the first fired. And so there was a radicalization process, right, that occurred while working in those mines, seeing people die in the mines, not getting the wages that he's promised, and then going to his first Communist Party meeting, because the Communist Party is sending people into the South to create interracial unions, which is an extremely radical idea for the late 20s and early 30s.
And he starts organizing. This young black man starts in the South. This coal miner starts organizing with the Communist Party, and he meets with some success.
Yes, he quits his job as a coal miner to work full time for the Communist Party, to engage in union organizing efforts. He has some success. He also gets arrested a lot of times. He comes close to death in Alabama several times. In any number of situations, he could have been murdered. He was falsely accused of murdering white women, and spent some time in jail for that. So there were, and if only for the one surviving white woman who said, "This isn't the guy," right? He would have been executed for that, right? So that he had a lot of really narrow escapes, to the point where he could no longer organize. In Alabama under his given name, which was Gene Braxton. So they sent him to Atlanta to begin organizing there, and he adopts, when he goes to Atlanta, the name Angelo Herndon.
So tell us about how he kind of meets with destiny in getting, basically a legal case gets brought against him. He gets arrested. He gets charged. Tell us about how he gets charged in the case that's going to take him to fame, actually.
Yeah, a lot of the canonical cases in kind of U.S. history are test cases, right? Or even anti-canonical cases like Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Which was about separate but equal rail cars in Louisiana. That was a test case. They brought Homer Plessy onto the train. So he could be arrested. They even brought the cop there. So he could be arrested to trigger that lawsuit. Same thing with Brown versus Board of Education. There were courageous, and all the companion cases, there were courageous parents of black school children who volunteered to be test cases, right? But Herndon's case was not a test case. He did not set out to try to create this great legal precedent. He was merely organizing black and white unemployed workers in Atlanta at the height of the Great Depression, and the Fulton County Commission decided to cut off all unemployment relief in 1932. And the Atlanta Constitution, which was no friend to black people at the time and no friend to poor people, said that there will be masses of starving people in Fulton County if you cut the $6,000 of unemployment relief. So Angelo Herndon organized an interracial peaceful protest for cutting off the unemployment relief at the Fulton County Courthouse. No one was arrested. No one illegally entered the building. In fact, one of the county commissioners invited only the white protesters to meet with him, and they were talking amiably with the police. They protested. 3 days later, the Fulton County Commission reversed course and reinstated all the unemployment relief money, and the Communist Party declared victory. And Herndon just goes to the post office one day to pick up the Communist Party's mail. He turns the key, and two plainclothes police officers immediately pounce on him and arrest him and hold him incommunicado for 11 days in the local jail. Don't charge him with a crime. Don't tell him what he's done wrong. They just hold him incommunicado to the point where when he finally comes before a judge, the judge says, you either need to charge this guy or you need to let him go. And it's at that point when the Fulton County prosecutors decide to use an old slave insurrection statute and charge Herndon with attempting to incite insurrection.
They're going to charge him with insurrection for that peaceful protest where people were chatting amiably with the police. And
I mean, that's part of it. I think what happens during the course of his arrest at the post office is they seize all the radical literature from underneath his arm. They then force him, without a search warrant, to take him to his boarding house. He takes them to one place where he doesn't actually live. They figure it out. And then the next place he actually lives there, and they seize all the radical literature from his room. And I think their theory of their case, because they knew they didn't have one about the peaceful protest, was the contents of that radical literature, the contents of those radical books, right? You can't kill a man because of the books he reads, was what was they thought that because of those books, because of that radical literature, because of the Daily Worker newspapers
right,
that Herndon had,
right.
that he was attempting to incite an insurrection.
We don't have time to go through the whole cast of characters who then, over time, leap to Herndon's defense. It's quite remarkable. It's a really diverse and unlikely cast of people who end up championing this case. But let's talk about some of them. Some of the people who kind of step forward and say, wait a minute, this shouldn't happen to this guy. Let's talk about Ben Davis.
Right. So Ben Davis Jr. is a child of the black middle class in Atlanta. He is a football star. Mm-hmm. He is a musician. He is a Renaissance man. He attended Amherst College. He then goes to Harvard Law School. He becomes one of the few black men barred to be a lawyer in the state of Georgia. But he has never tried a criminal case. He's a new lawyer. He reads about Herndon's arrest in the Atlanta Constitution, which is like, the arrest is like this, like one paragraph. And he goes over to the jail and he talks to Herndon and he says to him, I want to be your lawyer. And Herndon says, well, you're going to have to ask the International Labor Defense, which is the legal arm of the Communist Party.
Yeah.
Because they're in charge. And they didn't really have a good lawyer representing Herndon. They fired the white lawyer who was initially representing Herndon. And so Ben Davis Jr. and his partner, John Gear, another black lawyer, two black lawyers representing a black man on trial for his life, before an all-white jury, in Fulton County Court. That is not an easy task for any new lawyer.
And Herndon ends up recruiting his lawyer.
Right. I mean, Ben Davis Jr., as far as black people go in the 1930s, has had almost every advantage there is to have, right? He's gone to Morehouse for secondary school. He starts college at Morehouse, and then he goes to Amherst, and then he, goes to Harvard Law School. His father is, wealthy by the standards of the time, but he is really disenchanted with politics. In 1932, the Democratic Party in the South is completely racist and segregationist and reactionary. The Republican Party, of which his father was an active member, his father was just kicked out of his post as the Republican National Committeeman, which was a source of a lot of patronage for people in the South. So the Republican Party is out, and Ben Davis Jr. ends up joining the Communist Party, and the person who radicalizes him and the person who actually gives him his card to join the Communist Party is his client, Angelo Herndon. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And then the Communist Party really leans into the case and decides to make him a celebrity, basically. They decide to try to make this a huge deal. They want everybody to know about his case. They publicize it widely. They go hard for his case, and it does attract a lot of attention, and it even attracts people who are not communists at all. I mean, tell about some of the other people who start to get involved who are not affiliated with the Communist Party, but they come around.
Right. I mean, I'll list some of them off. I mean, the future great historian of the American South, Steve Van Woodward, is a young Georgia Tech English instructor, and he becomes involved with Ben Davis in the Interracial Committee to free Angelo Herndon. You have Carol Weiss King, a radical lawyer up here in New York. She becomes kind of the point guard of Herndon's legal team. You have Whitney North Seymour Sr., who is one of the best lawyers in the city. He worked at a law firm that still is working today at Simpson Thacher, and he takes the case on pro bono and argues it twice before the Supreme Court of the United States. You have Herbert Wexler and Walter Gellhorn, two young Columbia law professors who have recently clerked for Harlan Fiske Stone on the Supreme Court of the United States. And they really are the brief writers and the kind of legal minds behind the legal strategy for Whitney North Seymour. And then you have Charles Hamilton Houston, the leading black lawyer of his day, right? The first black member of the Harvard Law Review, and a mentor to Ben Davis Jr., who then convinces the NAACP, which hates the Communist Party, to say, hey, if you're not in on Angelo Herndon's case, if you're not willing to protect the free speech rights of black people, then there is no movement, right? This is everything the NAACP stands for, and he persuades his bosses at the NAACP to get involved in the case. So it just keeps going from there. That people from all walks of life, all political parties, right? Whitney North Seymour was a Republican, right? Getting involved, right? This case mattered to them,
right? And I think you do an amazing job of. You're a legal historian, and you're taking us through the legal twists and turns of the case in a way that's really intelligible to a non-lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. Can you just help us kind of give us a taste of the legal issues at stake and a little bit of how they played out? I mean, we don't have time to go all through it, but it seems like there's the free speech issue, obviously. There's the issue of the all-white jury, which Ben Davis raises. And there's the issue of insurrection, of like, is this guy guilty of insurrection? Is that a thing you can you send this guy to the death penalty for that?
Yeah, we could talk for an hour about all the legal issues, but I'm going to try to talk about them in real layman's terms. What the Communist Party wanted to do was put Fulton County, Georgia's all-white jury system on trial and use Herndon's case to do that. And that's what Ben Davis Jr. initially did. But what they didn't do, and what they decided not to do, was to argue that putting him on trial for the literature that he has violates his rights to free speech, violates his rights to peaceable assembly. They did not do that. Ben Davis Jr. didn't do that. And so after they lost the all-white jury issue for some technical reasons, right, they don't have a real good claim to raise on appeal. And so the challenge for Herndon's legal team becomes, how do we now bring these free speech claims before the Supreme Court of the United States when we haven't raised those claims at trial or before the Georgia Supreme Court? And that's kind of the legal puzzle that Herbert Wexler and Walter Gellhorn and Whitney North Seymour and Carol Weiss King and all those lawyers spend a long time trying to figure out how to solve.
I'm realizing I wish I had read this. I had read this out loud like 1 minute earlier, but let me just do it because I don't want this conversation to go by without doing this. It's hard. Like when I asked you in the beginning, how many of you heard of Angelo Herndon? If this was like 1932, 1933, every hand would have gone up. It's kind of hard to imagine. It was shocking to me how well known this case was, how widespread. I mean, let me just paint a picture. We all know Penn Station, right? Where that is. Imagine Penn Station. Imagine a black communist who was arrested in the South, and then people raise money for him to go out on bail, to get out of jail while he's on trial. And so then he gets on a train, and he takes the train to New York. And here's the scene when he arrives at Penn Station. A delegation of Communist Party leaders, including his lawyer turned newspaper editor Ben Davis Jr., met him on the platform. At 6:45 p.m., Herndon disembarked from the train. Party leader Robert Minor and vice presidential candidate James Ford hugged and kissed him. Ruby Bates, who's the former accuser turned chief defense witness for the Scottsboro defendants, hugged him and put her cheek next to his. Herndon and his older brother Milton, a fellow party activist, sized each other up, shook hands, and embraced. About 500 more people waited near the track entrances. A black porter alerted them to the track on which Herndon would be arriving. Several communist leaders hoisted Herndon on their shoulders and carried him up the marble stairs and into the south end of the jam-packed main hall. Someone thrust a large bouquet of red roses into his hands. Herndon waved his hat. About 7,000 to 10,000 people greeted him with thunderous cheers. 7,000 to 10,000 people at Penn Station for this scrawny black miner from Alabama. I mean, it's just astounding.
Yeah, and if you don't believe me, go to Moynihan Hall, and there is a mural of Herndon being carried up the stairs of Penn Station and out of the station. I think he was one of the most famous black men in America in the middle part of the 1930s. You know, there's Joe Louis, there's Jesse Owens. There's probably a few blues singers, right? And then there's Angelo Herndon, right? There are not many more people who was more recognizable, both for black people and for white people, than Herndon.
And then I was just trying to tally up all the places he speaks and how big the crowds were. I wrote down 10,000 at the Bronx Coliseum. Then he goes to Madison Square Garden and speaks. 15,000 people show up to hear him speak at Madison Square Garden. I mean, it's a phenomenon.
Yeah.
The question of what's going to happen with this guy. It's like people are hanging on the story and hoping and rooting for him.
Right, and the Communist Party is raising money for his legal defense, sends him on a nationwide speaking tour right from there.
It's just remarkable. Okay, I want to skip ahead a little bit to how he finally wins and the moment of winning. How does he finally win his case? And I hope I'm not spoiling the book for people. He wins. But that's not the end of the story even.
No, he wins because they figure out how to raise the free speech claims. They go back to a Georgia trial court after the Supreme Court dismisses his case. The U.S. Supreme Court says, you haven't raised these free speech claims properly. They go back into Georgia court. They find a Georgia trial judge with a guilty conscience. And we can talk about why he has a guilty conscience, but he has a guilty conscience. And he grants Herndon habeas corpus. He says, your conviction violated your constitutional rights. And so the government of Georgia is then forced to appeal that decision up to the Georgia Supreme Court and then back to the Supreme Court of the United States. And by that point, the trial judge has already ruled on First Amendment grounds that his conviction's unconstitutional. So Herndon wins 5-4 on April 26th, 1937. That his conviction violated his rights to free speech and peaceable assembly. And Justice Owen Roberts writes that abridging free speech should be the exception and not the rule, right? And really, I think, ties the idea that free speech and peaceable assembly are fundamental to our democracy. And just think about when it was written with the rising tide of fascism, right, in 1937, right? You had Mussolini and Hitler, and just, authoritarianism on the rise, in Europe. And Herndon's case resonated beyond, the American newspapers, right? People in Europe knew about Herndon's story.
Yeah. And then when he's freed and when he finally wins, he's in a rally for the people fighting for against fascism in Spain. And again, he goes back to Madison Square Garden, and this time it's 20,000 people.
Right.
Yeah.
But of course, the Communist Party sends all of these people, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade.
Right.
Right. Herndon's own brother dies in Spain.
Right.
Right. Fighting Francisco Franco and the fascist forces trying to overthrow and succeeding in overthrowing the Republican government in Spain.
okay, so here's a twist in the story. So now he's won. This is the big thing, was like, what's going to happen to this guy? He wins. And then what?
Well,
Then he comes to Harlem.
right, and reinvents himself, right, as so many talented black people do, right? First, he publishes a critically acclaimed autobiography with Random House.
Let Me
right?
Live.
Yeah, Let Me Live. Then he goes and becomes a staff writer. He replaces the future great novelist, Richard Wright. He's sort of a budding novelist at the time,
Right.
as the Harlem staff writer for the Daily Worker newspaper. Right, and then he starts his own. He leaves the Daily Worker and starts his own publication called the Negro Quarterly, which is a journal of Black life and politics, and hires as his managing editor another aspiring novelist named Ralph Ellison, and they publish their friends Langston Hughes.
Right.
They publish Gwendolyn Brooks.
Right.
Right. It's kind of amazing. He's now like at the forefront of Black literary life in Harlem after being an uneducated son of sharecroppers.
And Langston Hughes writes a one-act play about his life.
Right, Angelo Herndon Jones.
Yeah.
Right.
Just page after page. I was just like, wait, what? How did... It's an amazing story. It's an amazing story. Okay, so let's talk about you a little bit. So, one way, as I was thinking about on my way over here, I was kind of thinking, in some ways you're one of these cast. You're part of the cast of characters. Like, you got roped into the story. You got, hooked by his charisma and magnetism and the heroism of the story. Tell a little bit about, and you did research here at the New York Public Library, here across the street at the Schwartzman Building and at the Schomburg Center. So tell us a little bit about your journey, how you first learned about it, and the research you did here.
Well, I learned about Herndon's story as an undergraduate in a sophomore Afro-American history class taught by a great professor, Raymond Gavins. And we read a book called Scottsboro, The Story of the American South by Dan T. Carter. And so I started reading about Herndon in the context of that book. Scottsboro, if you don't recall it, were the 9 young black men who were falsely accused of raping 2 white women on a train. And they were convicted, and they spent years in jail. And I read the book about Herndon. That there was a monograph about Herndon that was pretty excellent. But it left me with like a burning question, like, what happened to this guy, right? Like, what happened to this guy after he was free? And that journey, that was really like a big question for me. Like, what did he do after the Negro Quarterly? Why did he kind of disappear from this public sphere kind of like all at once?
Yeah.
And so that was a real burning question for me. And then the second burning question for me as someone who teaches law students at Georgetown, that lawyers are the heroes of our constitutional narrative, right? Why did all these lawyers and why did all these individuals rally to Herndon's cause and donate their time and feel like that it was something worth fighting for?
Right.
So those two questions were really kind of burning for me.
So let's talk a little bit about that next part of his life. Like, there's this incredible just rocket to fame and to being at the center of politics and then being a literary figure, but then it all starts to kind of fall apart.
Right.
And takes a tragic turn.
Yeah. So, we're in the middle of World War II, and really Herndon thinks that the Negro Quarterly is his contribution to the war effort. A lot of what's written in the Negro Quarterly is like what black writers are saying about the war, how the war affects black people, what black people should do in order to like contribute to the effort in World War II, right? And so when his draft number comes up, he says, well, I'm exempt, right? I'm an editor of a major publication. I'm doing my part. Well, the local head of the draft board did not see things quite the same way and tried to make him 1A, which would mean immediately eligible to enter the military. And Herndon fought it, and it kind of gave the Communist Party a real black eye. And Herndon also had a long history of playing fast and loose with other people's money.
Right.
Some would say he embezzled other people's money, right? And, you never really knew what the finances of some of the endeavors that Herndon was up to, what they looked like.
Right.
And that caught up with him. But it was really the draft controversy which made it into all the New York newspapers, led by the World Telegram, that was giving the Communist Party a black eye. You see, by 1944, the U.S. and the Soviet Union are aligned.
Yeah, they're trying to be patriotic.
And so the Communist Party is all in on the Allies' war effort, and anything that takes away from the Allies' war effort is taking away from the liberty of the Soviet Union. And so they saw Herndon as, muddling the message of the party, so they broke with him. The party disavowed him. Herndon goes to the West Coast. He settles, in San Francisco. He thinks San Francisco and Oakland are like a mecca for black people. He publishes one more issue of the Negro Quarterly called "The South Goes West," which is at the Schomburg Center. The only copy in the world is at the Schomburg Center. I could not have written this book without the Schomburg Center, and the fact that they're celebrating their 100th anniversary today, it kind of gives me chills. If you haven't been there, you should go. It's amazing. All of the International Labor Defenses papers are there. The draft of "Let Me Live" with Herndon's corrections is there. And, there are a lot of really cool things.
That's cool.
At the Schomburg, and a lot of Ben Davis Jr.'s papers are there. And so I could not have written this book without that remarkable place.
So he's a little bit adrift.
He's adrift.
Yeah.
He's adrift. He tries to make a go of it. He engages in the same kind of shady financial dealings in the past. That's really his Achilles heel.
Yeah.
And the publication falls apart.
Yeah.
And his kind of literary dreams fall apart. And he tries to reinvent himself. He moves with his brother to Chicago, and he reinvents himself as a businessman. And he gets in trouble. He sells the same Chicago apartment building to like 3 or 4 different people, which is a problem. And so, the way I figured out what happened to Herndon was through librarians and archivists, who are my best friends, right? There was an archivist at the Chicago branch of the National Archives, and he said, and I wrote them all, right? Like I said, I'm writing this book. I need help. I'm trying to find what happened to Angelo Herndon. And he says, well, there's a court case involving a guy named Eugene Braxton, which is Herndon's real name. And he was in Joliet prison, right? He had been convicted of a federal crime for embezzlement. And then he tried to appeal that crime. And then I got his FBI file because J. Edgar Hoover had been watching Herndon from about 1936 to 1971. And when we finally sued and won against the National Archives and got his FBI file, the FBI was keeping track of him until they couldn't anymore. They lost track of him in 1971, and then no one really ever heard of Angelo Herndon again. His last public appearance was in Harlem in 1969, when Ben Davis Jr. becomes a big leader in the Communist Party. He goes to jail for allegedly violating the Smith Act and this federal law for teaching the overthrow of the government. And he dies shortly after getting out of prison, and he had written an autobiography in prison, and that was subsequently released after his death. And Herndon comes to Harlem to celebrate his lawyer, Ben Davis Jr. And there's a big party for Angelo Herndon. He kind of emerges from the shadows, and then he disappears. And no one ever sees him again, right? And he lives until 1997. And he dies in Sweet Home, Arkansas in 1997. And, he pops up in Milwaukee a little bit. I find him, but he's a hard person to find after 1971.
And I just want to say this one point out loud, because it came through so clearly in your book, that whereas in the context of the anti-communist fervor and witch hunts and people naming names and all this kind of stuff, like, yes, he has this tragic turn and he's adrift and he's doing shady things with money, but he never fingers his comrades.
Yeah, and he had a really good opportunity. A woman who worked for the Communist Party named Claudia Jones was going to be deported, and her lawyer was Carol Weiss King, Herndon's lawyer. And the feds bring in Angelo Herndon to testify against Claudia Jones as being a member of the Communist Party, and he won't do it. He said he shows up and he says, I'm not going to be used in this way by the federal government. If you want to deport Claudia Jones, you have to do it on your own, but you're not going to do it from information from me. And,
Wow.
And that was a pretty amazing moment. He was pretty vulnerable. He also never writes about the Communist Party, right? A lot of former communists, even Richard Wright, who was a member of the Communist Party, made money, writing, 2 articles in the Atlantic, so, he needed money.
Yeah.
He needed to be rehabilitated, but he never sells out his colleagues who really made him into a national figure.
Yeah. Okay, we're running short on time, and it's almost time for your questions, so please get those ready. Before we do, I feel like we have to come forward to the present. And
Okay.
of course, you can't be held responsible for the moment, the political moment in which your book arrives. It's not, but I want to read aloud the way you end this book, because if it's okay, because you
go.
end on a somewhat hopeful note about the precedent that Angelo Herndon leaves us with. And I just want to hear you kind of react to your own words here, if you would. America is a nation founded on political disagreement. The Constitution safeguards it, and indeed the history books often celebrate it. The American people are free to question their government without fear of retribution, to call for political, social, and economic change as long as they do so peacefully, rather than encouraging or participating in acts of violence. Generations of protesters from opposite sides of the political spectrum, civil rights activists and white supremacists, abortion rights and pro-life advocates, the Tea Party and Black Lives Matter, the pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian demonstrators, stand on the shoulders of Angelo Herndon.
So one thing, Brian, I know you know this as a published author, is that there is a lag between when you publish a book and political events. And I finished this book and wrapped it before the election. And I didn't know who was going to win. I think it's interesting now that events have proved what Herndon fought for means a lot, right? When people get picked up off the street and not charged with a crime and thrown in prison and held incommunicado, right? And I'm thinking about Mahmoud Khalil, and I'm thinking about Ramessa Ozturk, right? The precedents that lawyers like Carol Weiss King and others fought for, right, are their best chance, right? And what Herndon's case showed, and those Supreme Court precedents about free speech and peaceable assembly were hard fought and hard won, and were a kind of recent phenomenon in the 20s and 30s. There were no great free speech and peaceable assembly precedents before about 1930, right? So Herndon's case was on the vanguard of protecting free speech, both against the states and against the federal government. And I think what Herndon's case was really about was how essential free speech and peaceable assembly are in our democracy, and how people often abridge the free speech and peaceable assembly rights of the most vulnerable Americans. And being a black communist made Angelo Herndon one of the most vulnerable Americans. I think what we're seeing now is the most vulnerable people in our society are the first ones to have their free speech and peaceable assembly rights abridged.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
On that note, let's turn to the audience to hear some questions.
If you have a question, you can raise your hand. We have microphones floating around. Don't be shy.
Hello, and thank you for the book.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Of course. So my question is this. This says something about the United States of America. But let's compare this to the international world. If we were to do that, how would you do that?
Well, I'm not a comparative constitutional law scholar, so it's really hard for me to do, but I'm just going to repeat something that a friend of mine said to me about his country. And he said, we don't value free speech like you do in America. And I keep thinking about that, as the months have gone on and as people's free speech rights are being abridged, and about, I really still do believe that free speech and peaceable assembly are the pillar of our democracy, that we can't have a democracy without the ability to criticize the government. And so I do think, I think that's part of who we are as Americans. And I think that makes us different than some countries. Now, the difference between other countries and our country is our Constitution is very old. And other countries have engaged in a more recent process of constitution making than the United States. And that's given other countries, I think, an advantage in some ways about protecting human rights and protecting human dignity in a way. Those ideas aren't in the U.S. Constitution because it's so old. And the whole movement, the international movement for human rights, I think has influenced constitution making, in the last 30 to 40 to 50 years in a way that just wasn't part of the way the U.S. Constitution was established. And it's so difficult to amend the U.S. Constitution. That's one of its great flaws, that it's so difficult to amend, maybe too difficult to amend. So I think, I think it depends on the country, right? But I think a lot of these newer constitutions are protecting human rights in a way and doing things that we need free speech and peaceable assembly to do.
Brian mentioned Ruby Bates, and I'm wondering whether were there any other cases of overlap between Herndon and the Scottsboro boys?
Well, the Scottsboro case was a gigantic case.
It was also a national story.
It was a national story because of the Communist Party, right? And what's really interesting about Scottsboro, the Scottsboro case is a few years before Herndon's. They've already been convicted, right, by an all-white jury. 8 of the 9 are sentenced to death, right? And the Communist Party succeeds the first time they go up to the Supreme Court of the United States in a case called Powell versus Alabama, and said they didn't have adequate access to legal counsel at their first trials. So there are multiple trials of the Scottsboro defendants. There's certainly an overlap between the two cases. What's neat about Herndon's case is that when he is out on bail in 1935, he starts talking about we need to free the Scottsboro defendants, right? When 4 of them get out, right, at the first kind of event in New York City, Herndon's with them on the stage, right? He's writing pamphlets about Scottsboro, and he's a voice both as a public speaker and a writer in a way that the Scottsboro defendants couldn't be for themselves, right? And they just didn't have the means and the education to do it, right? And here you had this young, very photogenic guy who was really smart, right? Who could communicate. And so he became a huge asset, not just in his own case, but in the Scottsboro case. I don't think there was a bigger case than Scottsboro at that time. And I think what Scottsboro and Herndon's case showed that in the South, it looked like white supremacy was a form of fascism for black people, right? That you could railroad 9 young men for raping 2 white women and never let them out. You could, convict someone of attempting to incite insurrection and give them 18 to 20 years on a chain gang when there was no insurrection, when the Georgia Supreme Court said, oh, it's okay as long as there's a threat of violence at any time in the future because of the Communist Party's ideas, that conviction is okay, right? So, I think the cases are definitely linked.
I just want to say that he is very photogenic. And if you don't believe me, on your way out when you're buying a copy, and you certainly should, flip to the middle of the book and look at these photographs of him being lifted on people's shoulders at Penn Station, as we described. I mean, he's stunning.
He's also super young.
Yeah.
Right? Like many of the Scottsboro defendants, he's really young. He's 8. The papers report he is 19 years old. My time in the archives with the Alabama birth records showed he was 18 years old. I mean, he's a really young guy when he's just thrust into the national spotlight like this.
Do we have time for another question? Maybe a few more?
Thank you. This was really great. I really appreciate the talk and the engaging dialogue between you two. I also appreciated the highlight that, like, democratic rights, although we're in a democracy, quote unquote, democratic rights are often fought for by a movement. So that was really important and very much came out clear in what you were talking about. My question, which I'm wondering if you just answered it, is why go with the all-white jury first as opposed to going with freedom of speech first?
Yeah, it's a great question. Brian and I talked about it.
Great question.
Before the, when we were in the green room back there, and the Communist Party really thought that if they could put the Fulton County all-white jury system on trial, they would benefit not only Angelo Herndon, but all of the other black people who were going on trial for their lives in the South. That if you eliminate the all-white jury system, that black people just might be able to get a fair trial in the South. And they saw that with Scottsboro, right? The Scottsboro case, the first victory before the Supreme Court, is a case called Powell versus Alabama. And the second case for Scottsboro was a case called Norris versus Alabama. And in the Norris case, their convictions are overturned because they were tried by all-white juries. So there's kind of a structural change element to the jury system that I think the Communist Party was rightly attracted to. There was also a man in Maryland whose conviction had been overturned because of an all-white jury before Herndon's case. So they thought we could win. Here's what's difficult for us sitting in 2025 to understand. Free speech rights were in their infancy in 1932. There were not a lot of great free speech and First Amendment precedents, especially with regard to state governments, in which you could tell a state, hey, you can't do that because you're violating someone's free speech rights. There were like 2 Supreme Court cases, on point. There was not much else. And so that, now we think, well, why didn't they raise free speech? That was my thought, right? I'm with you. I'm like, this was pretty stupid. Like, this obviously violated his rights to free speech and peaceable assembly, but it just wasn't a thing, right? In 1932, the way it is now in 2025. And that's been an important development in our country, right? The way that it's just become part of our social fabric, that of course we have free speech and peaceable assembly rights, not only against the federal government, but also against the states.
Thank you.
Anyone else with questions? I saw other hands. No, right there.
This is incredible to hear about because I was in the studio doing a podcast, came to the roof, walked by, and then came into this. And also, quick before the question, and it'll maybe go into why I'm asking it. So I used to play Madison Square Garden. I ran the music for the NBA, the WNBA, the NHL. And it's a big place, it's always packed even when they're losing. So to see someone just be thrusted into this space like this, and then basically have to find themselves through adolescence, being an activist. In your research on him, did you come across anything that complicates the way his story is told and can give a holistic view to people who are being pulled into leadership or movement work today?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question. I really appreciate the way you articulated it in a way better than Brian and I were talking about it backstage. One thing that I was really struck by when Herndon was after the Supreme Court's decision, finally in 1937, Herndon goes by train. He's back in prison when the Supreme Court decides his case ultimately, and he takes a train back to New York, and he gives his first press conference, and the New York Times says, this is a different person than when this started, right? The Times had interviewed him when he was out on bail, that like Herndon's able to make all these connections between political events going on in our society in 1937 with the rise of fascism in Spain and the rise of Hitler and the rise of Mussolini and things that are happening domestically in American politics with the New Deal. And they're like, this guy's growth and just rise. They almost were saying, this is a different guy, right? This is not the same guy. And it forced him to grow up really fast, and he basically educated himself, right, during this entire time and while out on a speaking tour, and he made mistakes, right? And I think you saw him mature along the way, both kind of as an adult, but also his political maturation happened during this lawsuit, and that was really evident to the New York Times reporters. So, you know, he basically educated himself out on the public stage, and that's a hard way to do it.
And then struggled to reinvent himself yet a third time when he was adrift from the things that had kind of anchored him before. And that's hard on anyone.
Right. I mean, he was so famous and his identity was so closely tied to the Communist Party that when the Communist Party disavows him, right, it takes away the thing that people knew him for, and that just to try to reinvent himself without the Communist Party, of which he was ambivalent about by the 1940s, right? But still, without that anchor and that community that he had built up, it really set him adrift. You know, I know we disagree. Like, you called him tragic, and I still found him, Brian, all the way through super sympathetic. That, like, you know, we all have flaws, and, you know, as one of my friends says, if you want a perfect person, like, read fiction. Right, like, that in our society, all of our heroes have, you know, flaws. Herndon had flaws. He paid a price for those flaws, but that doesn't take away from all the amazing things that he did for us as a country with free speech and peaceable assembly, and for Black culture and American culture with the Negro Quarterly. So, you know, to me, the ledger is way on the credit side and not on the debit side.
You've convinced me.
Time for one more question.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. You're so articulate in describing his life and everything. I just have a question. The case, are you familiar with the Central Park jogger Gang of Five? I met someone last year who was in the park and knew the gentlemen that were convicted. Are there any parallels that you see in that case that come out of, I guess, the case law that established some precedents? And is there anything you can share where you see any kind of
I mean, the parallels is that if you're Black in the South and the police arrest you, there are coercive tactics and violence that the police do to you. They beat you up. You know, the third degree was just a thing in the South, right? And so the idea, what amazed me about Herndon's early life was the number of times that he easily could have been coerced into a confession, like the falsely accused young men of assaulting the Central Park jogger. I'm thinking about the case in Birmingham and the three white women who are shot, right? They took him out into a rural area, tied him up to a tree and assaulted him and to try to get him to confess, but he wouldn't. And so, you know, to think that this, you know, just happens, you know, in a vacuum in one case and, you know, about a horrific crime in Central Park, this has been going on for generations of, you know, Black men, you know, confessing to things that they didn't do. What amazed me about Herndon was that he never confessed to those things. Well, he was coerced a bunch. He never confessed, but he was certainly coerced by the police, into doing different things, right? He never to the point where he would implicate another member of the Communist Party, but sure, he was coerced. Like, no doubt about it. The system in the South was simply oppressive for black people. They had no voting rights. They were being victimized by the police. And, there was the courts, the federal courts, were really the only avenue, right, in the 1930s for any black person to get a fair shake, because there was no other way of effectuating change other than protest, right? Protest or the federal courts. And even then, the federal courts weren't that great, an avenue. So, I think black life in Alabama and black life in, Fulton County, Georgia in the 1930s was one of constant coercion. And I think what was interesting about Herndon's case is the black middle class figured out it wasn't just the communists that were going to be coerced. We were going to be coerced too by the police and by Fulton County prosecutors, and that we needed to get involved in Herndon's case, or they were going to come after us next.
Yeah, we might have underemphasized in this conversation how much he suffered in Fulton Tower. I mean, I don't know if we want to end on that note, but
he was
it's
incarcerated for a long time for a crime he didn't commit. He was starved. He was, physically ill. He was taken to hospitals. He was, examined by doctors. He could have easily died in prison during his, this 5-year journey from his arrest in 1932 to 1937. He spent most of that time, not all of it, but he spent a good chunk of that time, imprisoned for something he didn't do.
and he came out swinging,
Yes,
and we're all the better for it.
we are.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks for coming out.